Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There is something appropriate about marking the moment you chose to investigate this particular subject. Weaknesses in things that, by design, were never supposed to have them. We have been told repeatedly and with considerable conviction that the entities populating H.P. Lovecraft's cosmos represent ultimate indifference, that they exist beyond human comprehension and therefore beyond human resistance. This narrative has calcified into orthodoxy within horror scholarship and fan communities alike. The great old ones, we are assured, cannot be fought, only survived, if survival remains possible at all. Yet Lovecraft himself, across decades of correspondence and narrative construction, embedded vulnerabilities into nearly every entity he created. Some of these weaknesses appear deliberately, artifacts of narrative necessity in a pulp fiction market that demanded some measure of protagonist agency. Others emerge almost accidentally, byproducts of world building that required internal consistency, even while describing the fundamentally inconsistent. This investigation will examine what Lovecraft actually wrote, tracing the genealogy of cosmic vulnerability from ancient protective traditions through specific textual evidence and into our contemporary moment, where the question of monster weaknesses has become unexpectedly urgent. We will proceed methodically through four movements: the literary and philosophical origins of vulnerability, the specific nature of documented weaknesses, their manifestation in Lovecraft's key texts, and their disturbing persistence in our current cultural imagination. What we discover may not provide comfort, but it will provide clarity about what Lovecraft actually created and why we remain so desperate to find the cracks in cosmic horror's armor. Howard Phillips. Lovecraft spent much of his creative life constructing what he called cosmic indifferentism, a philosophical stance asserting that humanity occupies no privileged position in a mechanistic universe governed by forces utterly unconcerned with our existence. This worldview would seem to demand entities without weakness, monsters whose power derives precisely from their immunity to human agency or understanding. Yet across his fiction from 1917 through 1937, Lovecraft repeatedly inserted exploitable flaws into even his most cosmically significant beings. The steamboat that rams through Cthulhu's newly reformed head in The Call of Cthulhu represents perhaps the most famous example, but it is hardly alone. Wilbur Whateley's twin in The Dunwich Horror succumbs to a specific incantation read from a specific text. The deep ones of Innsmouth prove vulnerable to explosives and federal raids. Even the seemingly omnipotent Yog-Sothoth can be constrained by properly drawn elder signs. These vulnerabilities did not emerge randomly or carelessly. They represent calculated decisions by an author navigating between philosophical conviction and narrative pragmatism. The tension becomes visible in Lovecraft's voluminous correspondence, where he frequently distinguished between his cosmic philosophy and the requirements of commercial fiction. In a 1927 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft acknowledged that the presence of man as a factor inevitably compromised pure cosmic indifferentism, since protagonists required some capacity for meaningful action or the stories would collapse into passive observation. The pulp magazines that purchased his work, Weird Tales, Astounding Stories, others, operated within genre conventions established by decades of gothic and adventure fiction. Readers in the 1920s and 1930s expected protagonists who could investigate, discover, and occasionally triumph, even if that triumph came at tremendous psychological cost. Lovecraft found himself writing for an audience conditioned by Victorian literature, where even Dracula had his vulnerabilities to sunlight, garlic, and the sacred. The invisible man could be made visible through snow and paint. The mummy's curse could be broken through proper ritual. What distinguishes Lovecraft's approach is the studied ambiguity he maintained regarding whether these vulnerabilities represent genuine weakness or merely temporary impediment. When the Norwegian sailor Johansen rams his vessel through Cthulhu in The Call of Cthulhu, the entity's head immediately begins to regenerate, suggesting that physical damage means nothing to a being operating under alien biological principles. Yet Cthulhu does retreat back into R'lyeh's depths, either wounded or satisfied that the stars are not yet right for full emergence. Lovecraft never clarifies which interpretation is correct. This narrative strategy appears throughout his work. Apparent victories that might be mere delays, successful banishments that might represent the entity's own choice to withdraw. The reader confronts evidence of vulnerability without confirmation that vulnerability matters on cosmic timescales. The commercial context cannot be overstated when examining Lovecraft's insertion of weaknesses into his mythos. Weird Tales, his primary market, paid half a cent per word and demanded stories that could sustain reader interest across 10 to 20 pages of densely packed text. Pure cosmic horror, entities that simply exist beyond all human resistance, produces brief, monotonous narratives. The protagonist encounters the incomprehensible, goes mad or dies, and the story ends. This structure works for vignettes of a few thousand words, but fails to sustain the novelette length that commanded higher payment rates. Lovecraft needed his narrators to investigate, to discover protective formulas in ancient texts, to attempt desperate measures that might succeed or might merely postpone doom. The weaknesses embedded in his cosmic entities represent not philosophical compromise, but narrative engineering, the minimum concession to story structure required to make cosmic indifferentism marketable. Consider also the influence of Lovecraft's academic pretensions and his construction of pseudo-scholarly apparatus throughout his work. He filled his stories with references to imaginary grimoires, the Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon, that supposedly contained both summoning rituals and protective formulas. This approach mimicked actual occult literature, which never provided instructions for calling forth demons without corresponding methods for banishment or binding. The grimoire tradition, from the Key of Solomon through the Lesser Key, required this balance, establishing that forbidden knowledge worked symmetrically. If you could open a gate, you needed to be able to close it, or the knowledge would not have survived transmission across centuries. Lovecraft, steeped in antiquarian research, understood this pattern and replicated it, even while constructing a cosmos supposedly indifferent to human magical thinking. The resulting body of work contains an unresolved tension that has proven generative for subsequent writers and adapters. Lovecraft created entities meant to embody cosmic meaninglessness while simultaneously embedding them within narrative structures that granted meaning to human action. His monsters possess weaknesses because stories require weaknesses, because markets demanded protagonist agency, because magical traditions establish precedents, and perhaps because Lovecraft himself could not entirely commit to pure indifferentism when constructing plots that readers would follow through to completion. This foundational ambiguity, are the weaknesses real or illusory, effective or merely postponing, would shape every subsequent engagement with Lovecraftian horror. What began as commercial necessity became philosophical complexity, a productive contradiction that writers would explore for the next century. The concept that even the most powerful entities must possess exploitable vulnerabilities extends far deeper than commercial fiction conventions, reaching back through thousands of years of mythological and philosophical tradition. Ancient Greek mythology established the pattern with meticulous clarity. Achilles, mightiest of warriors, could be killed through his heel. Baldur the Beautiful, beloved of the Norse gods, fell to mistletoe after his mother, Frigg, secured oaths from every substance except that one overlooked plant. These weaknesses functioned not as narrative accidents, but as essential components of mythological logic. They demonstrated that absolute invulnerability represents a form of narrative and philosophical impossibility, that existence itself implies limitation, that to be something specific means not being something else. Lovecraft, widely read in classical mythology and comparative religion, inherited this tradition, even as he attempted to construct entities that transcended it. His old ones emerged from the same cultural matrix that insisted gods must have boundaries, that power must have parameters, that the universe operates according to rules, even if those rules originate in dimensions beyond human comprehension. The Gnostic and Hermetic traditions that flourished from late antiquity through the Renaissance elaborated this principle into complex systems of magical correspondence. These esoteric philosophies proposed that forbidden knowledge contained its own inherent safeguards, that the same geometric principles or verbal formulas that could summon entities could also bind or banish them. The medieval grimoire tradition codified this symmetry with remarkable consistency. The Key of Solomon, the Sworn Book of Honorius, the Lesser Key, with its 72 demons, all presented detailed instructions for protective circles, constraining pentacles, and banishment rituals alongside their summoning procedures. This was not merely practical advice for aspiring magicians, but theological necessity. If demons or angels could be called without corresponding methods of dismissal, the practice would represent suicide rather than sorcery. The occult revival of the 1890s through 1920s, which Lovecraft observed with fascination and disdain, revitalized these traditions through organizations like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which taught elaborate systems of protective symbolism and banishing rituals. Gothic literature established more immediate precedents for Lovecraft's approach to monster vulnerability. Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897 when Lovecraft was 7 years old, demonstrated how a monster could be overwhelmingly powerful, yet bound by specific limitations: sunlight, running water, the need for native soil, vulnerability to sacred objects and specific woods. These weaknesses did not diminish the vampire's threat, but rather intensified it, creating narrative tension through the protagonist's desperate research to discover and exploit each vulnerability. H.G. Wells employed similar logic in The Invisible Man, where the title character's power is absolute until the heroes discover methods of detection through snow, paint, and eventually violence. Mary Shelley's creature in Frankenstein possessed superhuman strength, yet proved vulnerable to isolation, fire, and the Arctic conditions that would eventually claim it. This Gothic tradition taught that monsters required weaknesses not to diminish horror, but to transform it from abstract dread into concrete conflict, from philosophical speculation into plot. The scientific materialism that dominated educated thought in Lovecraft's era paradoxically reinforced the necessity of monster weakness. If the universe operates according to mechanistic natural laws, then any entity existing within or intersecting with that universe must obey some form of physical principles, even if those principles derive from dimensions operating under non-Euclidean geometry or alien physics. Lovecraft's innovation was not rejecting this logic, but extending it. His entities possess weaknesses because they are material beings, however alien their materiality. Cthulhu can be struck by a steamboat because Cthulhu has physical substance that responds to force, even if that substance regenerates according to rules unknown to terrestrial biology. The Shoggoths can be destroyed by heat because they are protoplasmic entities subject to thermodynamic principles. This scientific framing distinguished Lovecraft from pure supernaturalists who could invoke magic as explanation. His cosmos operates according to natural law, just vastly more complex natural law than early 20th century physics could accommodate. Lord Dunsany and Arthur Machen, Lovecraft's most significant literary influences during his mature period, both established that otherworldly realms operate according to consistent internal logic, even when that logic contradicts mundane experience. Dunsany's gods, in the Gods of Pagana, possess immense power, yet remain bound by cosmic cycles and the limits of their own natures. Machen's little people, in The White People, and the great god Pan can be constrained by certain ancient knowledge, by specific locations, by the proper application of forgotten lore. Both writers demonstrated that effective cosmic horror requires not the absence of rules, but the presence of alien rules, systems of cause and effect that protagonists can potentially learn and exploit. Lovecraft absorbed this lesson thoroughly, constructing entities that seem beyond human resistance, yet prove vulnerable to those who acquire the right knowledge, perform the right actions, or simply exist at the right moment in cosmic cycles. The question of names and naming deserves particular attention within this genealogy of vulnerability. Across numerous magical traditions, knowing an entity's true name grants power over it, a principle encoded in everything from Egyptian magic to Jewish mysticism to European folk practices. Lovecraft subverted this tradition characteristically. His entities possess names like Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, and Nyarlathotep, yet knowing these names provides no control, instead marking the knower as potentially vulnerable to attention from the named. However, the principle survives, transformed. Not the name itself, but the complete knowledge, encoded in texts like the Necronomicon, might provide the formulas needed for protection or banishment. The difference is quantitative rather than qualitative. Where traditional magic required a single true name, Lovecraftian protection requires entire systems of alien mathematics, geometry, and linguistics. The vulnerability exists, but has been displaced into realms of knowledge so dangerous that acquiring it might cause more harm than the entity itself. This rich substrate of mythological, religious, philosophical, and literary tradition established multiple precedents for cosmic entities possessing weaknesses. Lovecraft did not invent the concept of vulnerable monsters, but rather inherited it from thousands of years of human storytelling, then subjected it to his particular synthesis of materialist philosophy and narrative craft. His innovation lay in making the weaknesses ambiguous in their effectiveness, uncertain in their permanence, and dangerous in their acquisition, transforming simple monster vulnerabilities into complex philosophical problems about knowledge, power, and human position in an indifferent cosmos. These cultural antecedents provided the raw material, but Lovecraft forged them into something distinctly his own through careful attention to language, symbolism, and the power of terminology itself. The language Lovecraft employed to describe protective measures against cosmic entities reveals a deliberate architecture of meaning, where terminology itself functions as a form of conceptual defense against the incomprehensible. Words like threshold, seal, sign, and ward carry centuries of accumulated magical and architectural significance, invoking traditions where language serves not merely to describe protection, but to enact it. The term elder sign, which appears across multiple Lovecraft stories and in the work of his correspondence, exemplifies this linguistic construction of vulnerability. Lovecraft never provided a definitive description of the elder sign's appearance. It remains variously depicted as a tree-like branch pattern, a five-pointed star with a central eye, or more abstract geometries, yet the term itself performs protective work through its components. Elder suggests both antiquity and authority, entities or symbols predating even the old ones. Sign invokes the semiotic tradition where marks carry power through their meaning, where representation and reality achieve dangerous proximity. The phrase suggests, without specifying, maintains protective ambiguity while asserting protective possibility. Consider the proliferation of terms involving barriers and boundaries throughout Lovecraft's protective vocabulary. Threshold appears repeatedly in contexts suggesting dimensional boundaries that entities cannot or will not cross without specific conditions being met. The word derives from Old English threshold, possibly relating to threshing or treading, marking the liminal space between domestic interior and exterior danger. When Lovecraft writes of thresholds in cosmic horror contexts, he activates this etymology's protective associations. The home as sanctuary, the doorway as place of power, where protective rituals concentrate their efficacy. Similarly, seal functions across multiple registers: the wax seal that authenticates and protects documents, the mechanical seal that prevents fluid escape, the mystical seal that constrains demons in grimoire tradition. Rillier remains sealed beneath the Pacific. Certain spells seal gates between dimensions. Elder signs function as seals against otherworldly incursion. The term's multiplicity allows Lovecraft to gesture toward protection without committing to specific mechanisms. Is it physical barrier, magical constraint, or something more abstract? The geometry of protection in Lovecraft's work constitutes its own linguistic domain, where mathematical and spatial terminology becomes weighted with defensive significance. He repeatedly invokes angles, curves, non-Euclidean shapes, and specific geometric configurations as either dangerous or protective, depending on their precise execution. The five-pointed star, or pentagram, carries obvious occult associations, employed in Western magical tradition as both summoning focus and protective circle. Lovecraft rarely uses pentagram directly, preferring star or simply describing geometric patterns, but the cultural resonance remains. More intriguingly, he suggests that certain angular relationships, particular degrees of intersection, specific ratios of measurement, possess inherent power independent of human magical thinking. This implies a universe where geometry itself operates magically, where mathematical relationships embody forces rather than merely describing them. Protection becomes a matter of correct calculation, of achieving angular precision that harmonizes with or contradicts the non-Euclidean mathematics governing entities from dimensions where parallel lines intersect and conventional geometry collapses. Material substances in Lovecraft's protective lexicon inherit meaning from centuries of fauche magic and occult practice. Silver, that traditional ward against supernatural harm, appears rarely in Lovecraft's work. He generally avoided vampires, werewolves, and other creatures bound by conventional supernatural rules. Instead, he emphasizes stone, particularly ancient stone, quarried and shaped by non-human intelligence. The monoliths of Ardrelia, the black stone of certain temples, the peculiar minerals composing Elder Thing cities in Antarctica. These substances resist cosmic forces not through mystical properties, but through their origin in alien or prehistoric contexts. Stone that has witnessed eons, that has been carved according to non-human aesthetic and engineering principles, supposedly maintains resistance to forces that would warp merely human constructions. The terminology here matters. Lovecraft writes of Cyclopean masonry, invoking the giants of Greek myth who built walls of such massive stones that later generations attributed them to superhuman origin. The word choice suggests that scale and antiquity themselves provide protection, that human works prove too ephemeral to withstand cosmic attention, but that the monumental endures. Temporal language permeates Lovecraft's construction of vulnerability and protection, establishing that cosmic entities operate according to cyclical rather than linear time. The phrase, "when the stars are right," appears across multiple stories, suggesting astronomical alignments that permit or prevent certain events. This conception derives from ancient astrological traditions, where planetary positions determined propitious or dangerous moments for action, but Lovecraft extends it to cosmic scale. The stars being right implies that entities like Cthulhu face temporal constraints, that their power waxes and wanes according to celestial mechanics, far beyond human influence. Other temporal terms carry similar weight. Cycles that span millennia, eons that measure geological rather than human time, epochs when particular entities held dominion before retreating or being displaced. This temporal vocabulary constructs a universe where vulnerability fluctuates across incomprehensible timeframes. An entity invulnerable today might prove susceptible in 10,000 years, or proved vulnerable 10 million years ago. The protection such temporality offers humanity is cold comfort. We might survive through cosmic accident of timing rather than any action we can control. The power of incantation and correctly spoken formulas represents another linguistic dimension of vulnerability in Lovecraft's work. Characters repeatedly encounter protective or banishing phrases in ancient texts, sequences of words that must be pronounced with precision to achieve effect. This invokes the Western magical tradition's emphasis on words of power, Hebrew names of God in Kabbalistic magic, Enochian cause in Dee's system, Latin formulas in Catholic exorcism. Lovecraft typically renders these as transliterations of imaginary languages. Funglui Mugawinaf, Cthulhu Relia Ugahnagel Ftagen becomes the most famous example. a sleep chant rather than protective formula, but its existence implies reciprocal banishment phrases. The unpronounceable quality of such formulas by human vocal apparatus suggests both their alien origin and the difficulty, perhaps impossibility, of employing them effectively. Protection exists in theory, encoded in language that human mouths cannot reliably form and human minds cannot safely comprehend. Names themselves function peculiarly in Lovecraft's protective linguistics. Unlike traditional magical systems, where knowing a demon's true name grants control over it, Lovecraft's entity names provide no such power. Speaking Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth does not constrain these beings. If anything, it risks attracting their attention. Yet the texts supposedly containing protective formulas also contain these names, suggesting that complete knowledge, not merely the name, but the entire context of nature, origin, and cosmic position, might offer some advantage. The Necronomicon's value lies not in listing names, but in providing comprehensive understanding, however maddening, of entities' roles in cosmic order. This transforms naming from simple invocation to complex epistemology. Protection requires not a single word, but an entire framework of alien knowledge. The symbolic language Lovecraft constructed thus operates across multiple registers simultaneously: architectural, geometric, material, temporal, and linguistic, each contributing to a system where vulnerability exists but remains difficult to access, dangerous to employ, and uncertain in effectiveness. His careful etymological choices activated existing traditions while transforming them into something distinctly modern and materialist, where protective symbols derive power not from supernatural sources, but from their relationship to alien physics and inhuman mathematics. This linguistic architecture supported Lovecraft's broader project of creating fictional myths that felt ancient, authoritative, and internally consistent, a project that required considerable craft in authenticity construction. Lovecraft's construction of a convincing mythological system required more than inventive monsters. It demanded the apparatus of historical depth, scholarly documentation, and internal consistency that makes fictional mythology feel like recovered truth rather than modern invention. The genius of his approach lay in recognizing that believable myths come packaged with their own mechanisms of transmission, preservation, and interpretation. Real mythological systems, whether Greek, Norse, or Egyptian, survive through fragmentary texts, conflicting accounts, and scholarly dispute about meaning and origin. Lovecraft replicated this texture of authenticity by creating imaginary source documents like the Necronomicon, then scattering references to these texts across multiple stories written over decades, building through accumulation what would have seemed thin in a single tale. Each mention of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred or citations of specific page numbers and editions reinforced the illusion that these texts existed somewhere, that careful research might locate them. This pseudo-documentary approach extended to monster vulnerabilities. If the Necronomicon contained summoning rituals, it must logically contain corresponding protective formulas, banishment procedures, or binding spells, the complete knowledge required for safe magical practice. The strategy of embedding protective knowledge within dangerous texts created a productive tension that enhanced rather than diminished cosmic horror. In traditional grimoire literature, protective formulas appeared separately from summoning rituals, often in preliminary sections describing circle construction, divine invocations, and purification procedures. Lovecraft collapsed this distinction, suggesting that the same text, sometimes the same passage, contained both the knowledge that endangered and the knowledge that protected. Dr. Armitage's desperate research in the Dunwich Horror exemplifies this pattern. He discovers the formula to banish the Whately spawn in the same Necronomicon that presumably contained Wilbur Whately's grandfather's instructions for breeding with Yog-Sothoth. The text itself embodies moral ambiguity, neither good nor evil, but simply comprehensive in its cosmic revelations. This narrative choice meant that seeking protection required the same dangerous research as seeking power, that one could not safely learn defensive measures without exposure to consciousness-shattering revelations. The vulnerability exists, documented and theoretically accessible, but accessing it costs sanity, morality, or both. Consider how Lovecraft established internal consistency regarding protective measures across his interconnected stories. The Elder Sign appears in The Shadow over Innsmouth as something that deep ones fear or avoid, in The Dunwich Horror as a pattern that can strengthen protective barriers, and in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath as a mark that grants safe passage through certain regions. While Lovecraft never precisely defined the sign's appearance or mechanism, he maintained consistency in its function. It represents knowledge or symbols predating the old ones, perhaps originating with the elder things of Antarctica or other ancient races who achieved mastery before Cthulhu's starspawn arrived on Earth. This consistency through ambiguity allowed other writers in Lovecraft's circle to incorporate the Elder Sign into their own stories while maintaining the symbol's mysterious potency. August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert Bloch could reference the same protective device without contradicting each other, because Lovecraft had established function without fixing form. A brilliant bit of collaborative world building that made the mythos feel like genuinely ancient lore, subject to varying transmission and interpretation. The role of folk knowledge and peasant wisdom in Lovecraft's protective schema deserves careful examination, as it reveals class and cultural anxieties embedded within his myth building. Throughout his fiction, ancient protective practices survive among rural or culturally isolated populations. The Quebec backwoods, the Massachusetts countryside, immigrant communities maintaining old world traditions. These populations possess protective knowledge through cultural inheritance rather than scholarly research, knowing that certain signs ward off certain dangers without understanding the cosmic principles involved. This narrative pattern draws on 19th century romantic valorization of folk wisdom as preserving truths that educated modernity has forgotten or dismissed. However, Lovecraft complicates this trope through characteristic ambivalence. The folk wisdom works, but those who practice it are depicted as degenerate, inbred, or in varying stages of genetic and cultural decay. Protection comes from sources Lovecraft's educated protagonists find repellent, forcing them to obtain crucial knowledge from people they would normally dismiss or avoid. This dynamic creates additional layers of narrative tension and reveals Lovecraft's conflicted relationship with modernity. Scientific rationalism leaves one vulnerable to cosmic horror, but retreating into atavistic traditionalism means becoming the horror. Lovecraft's use of conflicting accounts and scholarly uncertainty further enhanced his mythology's verisimilitude while complicating questions of vulnerability. Different texts supposedly provide different information about the same entities or protective measures, mimicking the condition of actual mythological scholarship, where sources contradict each other and interpretation remains perpetually contested. The Necronomicon might offer one version of a banishment ritual, the Narcotic manuscripts another, and the Book of Ibon a third, leaving characters and readers uncertain which account is accurate or whether all three describe different aspects of the same cosmic truth. This scholarly confusion appears deliberately constructed to prevent easy answers while maintaining the possibility that correct knowledge exists somewhere in the textual archive. It transforms protective formulas from simple solutions into research problems requiring comparison of sources, linguistic analysis, and ultimately educated guessing about which authorities to trust when dealing with forces beyond human comprehension. The concept of partial or temporary solutions permeates Lovecraft's construction of monster vulnerability, distinguishing his approach from conventional horror, where stakes through hearts or silver bullets provide permanent resolution. When the sailors in The Call of Cthulhu ram their vessel through the entity's head, they achieve at most a delay. Cthulhu retreats, but remains alive, if that word applies, imprisoned but not destroyed, waiting for more favorable cosmic conditions. The Dunwich horror is banished rather than killed, sent back to whatever dimension spawned it, but presumably capable of being summoned again by anyone with sufficient knowledge and malice. Even the deep ones defeated at Innsmouth represent a single community destroyed, while the species continues its vast, undersea existence. This pattern of impermanent victory reflects Lovecraft's cosmic pessimism. Human resistance can achieve temporary respite, but never final triumph against forces that operate on geological timescales and exist across dimensions. The vulnerabilities his entities possess allow for local, temporary survival, but not species-level or cosmic-level success. The deliberate construction of this mythology required Lovecraft to balance multiple competing demands, creating entities that felt genuinely alien and threatening while embedding them in narrative structures that permitted protagonist agency, establishing consistent cosmology while maintaining ambiguity about specific details, providing protective mechanisms while ensuring those mechanisms remain difficult to access and uncertain in effectiveness. His success in navigating these tensions produced a mythology that has demonstrated remarkable durability precisely because it feels incomplete, fragmentary, subject to ongoing interpretation and expansion. The protective formulas and entity vulnerabilities exist within this mythology as possibilities rather than certainties, suggestions rather than solutions, maintaining cosmic horror's essential element, the suspicion that even our defenses are temporary, inadequate, or illusory. Having established the historical, cultural, linguistic, and narrative foundations Lovecraft built upon, we must now examine the specific nature and themes of vulnerability as they appear in his cosmic philosophy, moving from how he constructed monster weaknesses to what those weaknesses reveal about his understanding of existence, knowledge, and human position in an indifferent universe. The fundamental tension within Lovecraftian monster vulnerability emerges from the collision between cosmic indifferentism as philosophy and narrative structure as commercial necessity. Lovecraft maintained throughout his correspondence and essays that humanity occupied no special position in a mechanistic universe, that our hopes, fears, and struggles registered as less than dust motes in the cosmic scope. Yet every story requires conflict, and conflict requires the possibility, however remote, that protagonist action might matter. This paradox produces a distinctive form of vulnerability in Lovecraft's entities. They possess weaknesses, not because the universe cares about human survival, but because they are physical beings subject to physical laws, however alien those laws might be. A steamboat can damage Cthulhu not through divine providence or moral righteousness, but through simple material collision, mass times velocity applied to biological substance. The philosophical implication cuts deeper than simple monster weakness. If cosmic entities are vulnerable to material force, they are not truly beyond comprehension, merely beyond current comprehension. The horror shifts from encountering the absolutely unknowable to recognizing that what can be known might be worse than ignorance. Materialist vulnerability operates throughout Lovecraft's cosmos as a principle that simultaneously offers hope and intensifies dread. When entities from other dimensions manifest in our reality, they must adopt or project forms subject to thermodynamic principles, spatial constraints, and temporal sequence. The Shoggoths, those protoplasmic servants of the elder things, can be destroyed through heat and dissolution because they are material organisms, however alien their cellular structure. The MyGo harvest human brains precisely because those organs contain physically encoded consciousness that their technology can preserve and transport. Even Azathoth, the blind idiot god at the center of all existence, apparently requires attendant beings to pipe soporific music, suggesting dependency rather than absolute autonomy. This materialism means that every entity possesses parameters, and parameters imply limits, and limits create vulnerability. Universe operates according to natural law, even in its most alien corners, a realization that makes cosmic horror more terrifying rather than less, because it means the horror is real, physical, and potentially accessible rather than safely abstract and metaphorical. Temporal weakness constitutes perhaps the most philosophically significant vulnerability across Lovecraft's mythology. The repeated phrase, "when the stars are right," indicates that cosmic entities face constraints imposed by astronomical cycles, dimensional alignments, or other chronological factors beyond human control or even comprehension. Cthulhu remains imprisoned not through any human action, but because cosmic timing does not yet permit his full emergence. This temporal vulnerability offers humanity no agency. We survive through accident of when we happen to exist, rather than through any protective measures we might implement. The implications here are bleaker than simple monster weakness. We are irrelevant to our own survival, passengers on a cosmic timeline that may eventually deliver us to destruction regardless of our preparations or resistance. Yet this same temporal structure suggests that entities themselves are bound by forces they cannot control, that even the old ones must wait for conditions they did not create and cannot alter. The cosmos is indifferent not only to humanity, but to its own monstrous inhabitants. The question of psychological fragility introduces more complex possibilities within Lovecraft's framework. Certain entities seem to derive power from human attention, belief, or emotional states, suggesting that consciousness itself might serve as either nourishment or anchor for forces that would otherwise remain purely potential. Nyarlathotep, the crawling chaos, appears most frequently when humans seek forbidden knowledge or gather in cults, implying that human desire and will partly manifest his presence. This psychological dimension creates a disturbing vulnerability. The entity can be weakened or dismissed by withdrawing attention, refusing belief, or maintaining psychological discipline. However, achieving such mental discipline after encountering cosmic horror represents the deepest challenge. The very knowledge required for protection damages the mind's capacity to maintain protective denial. We must acknowledge the horror to resist it, but acknowledging it corrodes our ability to resist. This catch-22 transforms psychological vulnerability into existential trap rather than exploitable weakness. Information as weakness represents one of Lovecraft's most sophisticated contributions to cosmic horror philosophy. Certain entities apparently cannot maintain full presence when subjected to comprehensive documentation, systematic study, or complete understanding. The act of knowing, truly knowing, might bind or limit what is known, transforming the ineffable into the merely incomprehensible, and the incomprehensible into the ultimately comprehensible, given sufficient time and resources. This suggests that the true protective formula is not mystical incantation, but scientific method. Observe, document, theorize, test, refine understanding until the alien becomes analyzable. Yet Lovecraft consistently presents this path as more dangerous than ignorance, because the information required for complete understanding includes mathematics that warp spatial reasoning, biology that redefines life and death, and cosmology that eliminates all human significance. The protective power of knowledge comes at the cost of everything that makes life psychologically bearable. Safety, through understanding purchased with the annihilation of meaning. The observer effect operates peculiarly in Lovecraft's cosmology, where human consciousness serves simultaneously as target and potential weapon against cosmic forces. Our minds are fragile instruments that shatter when confronting true cosmic reality, yet that same fragility might provide protection. Entities that exist across dimensions or outside conventional time may find human consciousness too limited to serve as proper anchor or conduit. We survive not through strength, but through inadequacy, protected by our own perceptual and cognitive restrictions. The characters who maintain sanity longest in Lovecraft's stories often do so through reflexive skepticism, refusing to fully accept what they witness until overwhelming evidence forces acknowledgement. This suggests that belief itself operates as vulnerability. The cultist who worships Cthulhu has opened psychological channels that the skeptical scientist has not, making the cultist simultaneously more powerful and more endangered. These core philosophical concepts, materialism, temporality, psychology, information, and consciousness, interact throughout Lovecraft's work to create a complex system where vulnerability exists but provides no comfort. Entities can be damaged, delayed, or dismissed, yet none of these actions addresses the fundamental cosmic horror. We exist in a universe of material forces that occasionally intersect catastrophically with human reality, and our survival depends less on our actions than on cosmic accident. The weaknesses embedded in Lovecraft's monsters illuminate not paths to victory, but the precise parameters of our helplessness. Having established these philosophical foundations, we must now examine specific entities and their documented vulnerabilities, moving from abstract principles to concrete manifestations of cosmic weakness. Cthulhu, perhaps Lovecraft's most iconic creation, demonstrates the ambiguity inherent in cosmic vulnerability through the famous steamboat collision in The Call of Cthulhu. When the Norwegian sailor Johansen rams the yacht Alert through the newly risen entity's head, the text describes how the awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. The collision produces immediate physical effect. Cthulhu's head bursts apart with a slushy nastiness before beginning immediate regeneration. This scene has generated decades of interpretive debate. Does physical damage genuinely harm Cthulhu, or does the entity simply find the encounter insufficiently important to pursue? The text provides no definitive answer, noting only that Cthulhu retreats back to Arlaya's depths after reforming, possibly because the stars were not yet right for full emergence. The vulnerability here operates on multiple levels simultaneously: material susceptibility to kinetic force, temporal constraint based on astronomical alignment, and the mysterious mechanics of imprisonment in Rulia itself. None of these weaknesses offers genuine hope for humanity. They represent at most temporary delays before eventual emergence. Nyarlathotep presents an entirely different vulnerability profile, one rooted in his role as messenger and agent rather than imprisoned force. The crawling chaos appears throughout Lovecraft's work and in numerous forms: the tall, swarthy man of Nyarlathotep, the howling cosmic wind in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, various manifestations in the dreamlands. His power seems fundamentally tied to human interaction, to the cults he gathers and the knowledge he disseminates. This creates a peculiar weakness. Nyarlathotep achieves nothing through direct cosmic force, but instead works through manipulation, persuasion, and the exploitation of human curiosity and ambition. His schemes can be thwarted not through mystical protection, but through recognizing his manipulations and refusing participation. Yet this weakness is largely theoretical. Lovecraft's characters typically lack the psychological strength or information to resist once Nyarlathotep has begun his work. The vulnerability exists in principle while remaining practically inaccessible, a pattern that recurs throughout Lovecraft's carefully constructed mythology. Yog-Sothoth, described as coterminous with all time and space and existing at all angles simultaneously, should logically possess no vulnerability whatsoever. Yet, the Dunwich horror demonstrates clear limitations. The entity can be confined by elder signs, prevented from manifesting fully by specific geometric wards, and the spawn it produces through human breeding can be banished through proper incantation. The text describes how Dr. Armitage reads a formula from the Necronomicon that sends the weightly creature back to the nighted spaces betwixt the stars from which it emerged. This banishment succeeds not through moral authority or divine intervention, but through correct application of alien knowledge, speaking the right words in the right sequence at the right location. Yog-Sothoth's vulnerability thus appears epistemological: complete cosmic presence constrained by information structures, by formulas that work not through magic but through exploiting dimensional mechanics. The entity can reach into our reality, but that reaching creates points of contact where properly applied knowledge can sever the connection. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, remains largely absent from direct manifestation in Lovecraft's work, despite frequent invocation by various cults. This absence itself might constitute vulnerability, an entity whose power depends on worshippers, but who cannot or will not manifest directly to protect or empower them. The various young of Shub-Niggurath that appear in Lovecraft Circle's works prove vulnerable to conventional violence, suggesting that even the offspring of an outer god operate under biological constraints once manifested. The pattern suggests that full manifestation in our dimensional framework requires adopting limitations, that the price of presence is vulnerability. Entities that remain purely conceptual or transdimensional cannot be fought, but they also cannot act directly. Those that manifest can act, but become susceptible to action against them. Azathoth occupies a unique position in Lovecraft's hierarchy, the nuclear chaos at the center of ultimate reality, mindless and all-powerful, requiring attendant beings to pipe monotonous music that maintains its slumber. This bizarre dependency represents perhaps the most philosophically troubling vulnerability in the entire mythology. If Azathoth embodies ultimate cosmic power, why does it require servants and music? The implication is that even fundamental cosmic forces operate within systems of relationship and dependency, that nothing exists in pure isolation, that power and vulnerability are not opposites, but aspects of the same phenomenon. The practical exploitation of this weakness seems impossible. One cannot fight Azathoth, cannot even approach the throne where it bubbles and blasphemes, yet the weakness exists as metaphysical principle, suggesting that the universe maintains internal checks on even its most destructive forces. The deep ones of Innsmouth demonstrate vulnerabilities that closely parallel terrestrial biology while incorporating alien elements. Federal agents massacre the hybrids and deep ones through conventional explosives and firearms in the raid that concludes the shadow over Innsmouth. The creatures prove susceptible to physical damage, despite their amphibious nature and apparent immortality. Yet vulnerability to violence coexists with biological advantages that make permanent extermination unlikely. The deep ones dwell in vast undersea cities, reproduce prolifically, and interbreed with humans to create hybrid populations that gradually transform into full deep ones. The Innsmouth raid destroys a single community, but cannot touch the species as a whole. This pattern recurs throughout Lovecraft's work. Local victories achieved through physical force, while cosmic or global threat remains undiminished. The vulnerability is real, but insufficient for any meaningful defense. The might go from Yog-Sothoth, present technological rather than biological vulnerability. These fungus crustaceans from beyond Pluto employ advanced machinery for mining operations, brain extraction, and interstellar transport. Their technology can be observed, studied, and potentially disrupted or countered through human scientific advancement. Yet, the Whisperer in Darkness reveals how this vulnerability means little in practice. The My-Go operate with such technological superiority that human resistance proves futile. They can record and replicate human voices perfectly, create synthetic bodies to house transported brains, and traverse interstellar distances while humanity barely grasps atomic structure. The vulnerability exists in theory. Their machines can be broken, their operations can be investigated. In practice, the technological gap ensures that understanding their weakness provides no path to exploitation. We can comprehend their vulnerability while remaining helpless to utilize that comprehension. The pattern emerging across these entities reveals that Lovecraftian vulnerability operates simultaneously on multiple levels: material, temporal, epistemological, psychological, while consistently failing to provide genuine hope for human victory or survival. Each entity possesses specific weaknesses that can be documented and analyzed, yet those weaknesses either prove irrelevant to cosmic scale threat or require conditions humanity cannot achieve without self-destruction. The vulnerabilities exist not as flaws in Lovecraft's world-building, but as essential components of his philosophical project, demonstrating that even in a universe where monsters can be hurt, humanity remains cosmically insignificant and ultimately doomed. The protagonists who survive encounters with Lovecraftian entities rarely do so through heroic action or clever exploitation of monster weaknesses. They survive through accident, cosmic indifference, or because the entity chooses not to pursue them. Professor Angel, in The Call of Cthulhu, dies of apparent heart failure after piecing together evidence of the cult, while his nephew Thurston, who completes the investigation, survives only long enough to compile the manuscript we supposedly read. Thurston explicitly expects death, noting in his conclusion that I shall probably not live long after I have written these words. The survival here is temporary at best, a brief reprieve before the knowledge he has acquired attracts fatal attention. This pattern establishes that investigating cosmic horror initiates countdown toward destruction, regardless of precautions taken. The characters who know are doomed not by what they do with knowledge, but by possessing it at all. Their agency extends only to the speed and manner of their inevitable demise. Yet Lovecraft does provide rare examples of effective human action against cosmic threats, and examining these exceptions illuminates what passes for agency in his universe. Dr. Armitage, in The Dunwich Horror, successfully banishes the Whately spawn through research, preparation, and correct application of the formula he discovers in the Necronomicon. His success requires multiple factors aligning: access to one of the few existing copies of the forbidden text, sufficient linguistic skill to read it, psychological resilience to comprehend what he reads without complete mental collapse, physical proximity to the entity at the moment of incantation, and the entity remaining vulnerable to dismissal rather than having fully manifested. Remove any single factor, and the attempt fails. This is not heroism in conventional narrative terms, but rather the accidental confluence of necessary conditions. Armitage's agency is real yet contingent, effective yet unrepeatable. He cannot teach others his method without exposing them to the same sanity-destroying knowledge he acquired. The victory is personal, local, and leaves cosmic balance completely unaltered. The protective power of ignorance operates as persistent subtext throughout Lovecraft's work, suggesting that those who remain unaware of cosmic horror are paradoxically safer than those who seek to understand and resist it. The farmer who burns the strange fungus without investigating its origin survives, while the botanist who studies it summons attention that proves fatal. The skeptic who dismisses cult activity as superstition lives, while the anthropologist who takes it seriously enough to research becomes vulnerable to the very forces he studies. This creates a disturbing calculus where knowledge equals vulnerability and ignorance provides protection, a direct inversion of Enlightenment principles that equated knowledge with power and safety. Lovecraft's cosmos punishes curiosity, investigation, and the scientific method, revealing them as paths not to understanding and control, but to exposure and destruction. The characters who do things right by remaining incurious and accepting conventional explanations survive through intellectual cowardice that Lovecraft presents as inadvertent wisdom. Bloodline factors introduce biological determinism into questions of vulnerability and resistance. The marshes of Innsmouth carry deep one ancestry that makes them susceptible to the Innsmouth look and eventual transformation, but this same ancestry might provide resistance to the psychological shock that destroys purely human minds. Wilbur Whateley's hybrid nature grants him abilities far beyond human capacity, while also ensuring his eventual transformation into something that cannot survive in human society. The implication is that genetic heritage determines cosmic vulnerability. Some bloodlines are cursed or blessed with connections to entities that alter their relationship to horror. This genetic essentialism reflects Lovecraft's documented obsessions and prejudices while also serving narrative function. It explains why some characters withstand encounters that would annihilate others, why certain families possess protective knowledge, why resistance to cosmic horror might be hereditary rather than learned. The vulnerability is written into biology, determined before birth, unalterable through will or action. Psychological resilience appears throughout Lovecraft's work as perhaps the most important human quality for surviving cosmic horror, yet the text consistently suggests that such resilience derives from deficiency rather than strength. The narrators who retain sanity longest often do so through reflexive materialism that refuses to accept evidence until overwhelmed by it. They function with what might be called protective skepticism, a psychological defense mechanism that delays comprehension and therefore delays mental collapse. Lovecraft's scientific protagonists survive initial encounters because their training requires rigorous standards of evidence that supernatural events struggle to meet. By the time the evidence becomes undeniable, the immediate threat has often passed. This is not rational heroism, but adaptive cowardice, a survival mechanism that works precisely because it prevents the full comprehension that would enable either effective resistance or complete psychological destruction. The characters who understand fastest die fastest. Those who understand slowest survive long enough to flee. Consider the role of academic skepticism as accidental protection throughout the mythos. University professors, museum curators, and research scientists populate Lovecraft's stories as protagonists who possess the knowledge to recognize cosmic horror when they encounter it, but whose professional training delays acceptance of that recognition. Dr. Willett, in The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, spends months investigating before accepting the supernatural elements of the case, and this delay probably saves his life. Had he comprehended immediately, his psychological defenses would have crumbled before he could prepare adequate protection. The academic mind is trained to doubt, to seek alternative explanations, to require reproducible evidence. These professional habits infuriate readers who want protagonists to act decisively but reflect psychological realism. The human mind resists accepting that material reality contains non-material horrors, that the universe operates according to principles that annihilate meaning. Academic skepticism slows comprehension, and that slowness permits gradual adaptation that immediate understanding would prevent. Communities that endure through inherited protective rituals represent another form of human agency against cosmic horror, the one that requires sacrifice of individual autonomy and intellectual development. The various backwoods settlements, isolated fishing villages, and immigrant enclaves throughout Lovecraft's New England possess folk knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge of which symbols provide protection, which dates require vigilance, which actions invite danger. These communities survive not through understanding why their rituals work, but through unquestioning obedience to tradition. The rituals themselves may derive from ancient contact with the entities they now guard against, creating disturbing circularity. Protection comes from the enemy, purchased through compromise or tribute that earlier generations negotiated. The communities that practice these rituals pay continuous subtle costs: genetic degradation, cultural isolation, psychological damage distributed across generations. They survive, but survival has transformed them into something that Lovecraft's educated protagonists find nearly as horrifying as the threats the rituals guard against. The function of agency in Lovecraft's cosmos thus operates according to principles that subvert conventional narrative expectations. Protagonists who act decisively based on horror fiction conventions, organizing expeditions, confronting entities directly, seeking to destroy the threat, invariably die or go mad. Those who survive do so through hesitation, retreat, or accidental alignment with cosmic cycles they do not control. The weakness embedded in Lovecraft's entities exists not to be exploited through human cleverness, but to demonstrate that even when monsters are vulnerable, we lack the capacity to effectively employ that vulnerability. Our agency is real, but cosmically irrelevant. Our victories are local and temporary, and our understanding is the very thing that ensures our doom. The Necronomicon functions throughout Lovecraft's mythology as the supreme example of knowledge that simultaneously protects and destroys, embodying the paradox that understanding cosmic horror's weaknesses requires exposure to information that corrodes sanity and meaning. Abdul al-Hazred's Mad compilation supposedly contains detailed descriptions of entities like Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth, along with the geometric and linguistic formulas required to summon or banish them. This double function, the same text that teaches conjuration also provides dismissal, creates an impossible epistemological situation. To defend against cosmic horror, one must consult the Necronomicon. To consult the Necronomicon is to expose oneself to precisely the corrupting knowledge that makes defense psychologically impossible. Dr. Armitage successfully employs the text in The Dunwich Horror, but the story emphasizes his visible aging and psychological damage following the encounter. He survives with his sanity technically intact, but profoundly altered, marked by what he has read and understood. The knowledge worked, the vulnerability was exploited, yet the cost approaches or exceeds the value of victory. This epistemic trap operates across multiple levels of Lovecraft's carefully constructed mythology. The surface level involves immediate psychological damage from exposure to alien concepts, geometries that should not exist, life cycles that violate biological possibility, cosmologies that eliminate all human significance. Reading descriptions of non-Euclidean architecture or witnessing deep one transformation apparently damages neural structures in ways that cannot heal, as if human brains possess fundamental limits beyond which comprehension becomes synonym for destruction. The next level involves moral corruption, where understanding cosmic truth reveals human ethics as provincial delusion. Characters who comprehend the true nature of reality find conventional morality meaningless. Murder, sacrifice, betrayal become neither good nor evil, but simply actions without cosmic significance. The deepest level involves ontological collapse, where the very categories through which humans understand existence, time, space, causation, identity, prove inadequate or actively misleading. To know enough to exploit monster weakness requires accepting that the self doing the exploiting is illusion, that action is meaningless, that survival and death are equivalent states. The texts beyond the Necronomicon, the Pentateuch manuscripts, the Book of Eibon, Unersprechlichen Kulten, the Solano fragments, each supposedly offer different perspectives on cosmic reality and corresponding protective formulas. Lovecraft created this library of forbidden texts to suggest that knowledge exists in competing versions, that no single source provides complete or entirely reliable information. This multiplicity serves narrative function, allowing different stories to reference different authorities and creating the texture of scholarly dispute. It also intensifies the epistemological problem. Comprehensive protection requires cross-referencing multiple forbidden sources, exposing oneself repeatedly to sanity-destroying content, learning to recognize which accounts are accurate and which are corrupted. The research necessary for complete understanding becomes a multi-decade project requiring linguistic expertise in dead or alien languages, access to texts scattered across continents and jealously guarded by institutions or individuals, and psychological resilience that probably does not exist in human neurology. Knowledge sufficient to exploit monster weakness exists, but remains practically inaccessible except through self-destruction. Consider how Lovecraft's protagonists acquire protective knowledge and what that acquisition costs them. Henry Armitage, having read the relevant sections of the Necronomicon, successfully banishes the Whately spawn, but emerges from the experience permanently changed, aged, psychologically scarred in ways the text implies but does not detail. Wilmoth, in The Whisperer in Darkness, gains understanding of the MyGo through correspondence and eventual encounter, learning their vulnerabilities and methods, but that knowledge comes packaged with the revelation that human identity is transferable, that consciousness can be extracted and stored, that the self is meat and electricity rather than sacred essence. Escapes physically intact, but epistemologically shattered, his entire framework for understanding reality revealed as comfortable fiction. The pattern suggests that protective knowledge cannot be cleanly extracted from corrupting knowledge, that they are aspects of the same comprehensive understanding. You cannot learn only the useful parts. The cosmos does not permit such selectivity. The trap becomes most visible when examining characters who seek protective knowledge preemptively, hoping to prepare defenses before encountering actual threat. Their research invariably attracts precisely the attention they hope to avoid. Studying Cthulhu makes one interesting to Cthulhu's cults, or perhaps to the entity itself. Investigating Deep One biology draws Deep One notice. The act of seeking protective information serves as a beacon to the forces one hopes to guard against, as if cosmic entities possess awareness of who studies them, or as if knowledge itself creates connection, independent of physical proximity. This creates another layer of epistemic trap. Ignorance leaves one unprepared but safe, while knowledge preparation eliminates safety and may not provide adequate preparation. The only escape from this dilemma is refusing to engage with cosmic horror at all, living in deliberate ignorance, avoiding investigation, accepting pleasant lies about reality's nature. Lovecraft presents this option as both wisest choice and profound intellectual cowardice. Information itself operates as a vulnerability in Lovecraft's cosmos through mechanisms that suggest consciousness and knowledge are not passive observations, but active participations in reality. To know about an entity is to create cognitive space for that entity, to provide it with an anchoring point in human thought that might enable manifestation or influence. The cultists who worship Cthulhu maintain collective belief that sustains or strengthens the entity's presence in our dimensional framework. The scholars who study cosmic entities without worship still dedicate mental energy and attention that might serve a similar function, creating unintended worship through obsessive investigation. This implies that the safest approach is collective amnesia, destroying all texts, prohibiting all research, ensuring that cosmic entities fade from human consciousness entirely. Yet this solution is impossible. Texts survive, knowledge persists, and human curiosity regenerates investigation in each generation. The vulnerability of consciousness to corruption by knowledge cannot be eliminated, only managed through choosing which corruptions to accept. The irony embedded in this system deserves emphasis. Lovecraft created fictional grimoires containing fictional knowledge about fictional entities, then structured that fiction to suggest that seeking such knowledge in fiction mirrors the danger of seeking it in reality. Readers who become obsessed with Lovecraft's mythos, who memorize entity names and study fan-created hierarchies and debate which protective formulas work against which entities, are themselves performing the precise behavior that Lovecraft depicted as path to destruction. The fiction colonizes reader consciousness, exactly as it warns against allowing entities to colonize consciousness. This is not an accidental effect, but deliberate design. Lovecraft wanted his mythology to feel dangerous, to seem like knowledge better left alone, to create genuine intellectual and psychological unease in those who studied it too deeply. The forbidden knowledge functions as forbidden knowledge, creating actual epistemic vulnerability in readers who pursue comprehensive understanding. The ultimate question becomes whether any knowledge can protect against cosmic horror, or whether all protective formulas are comforting fictions we tell ourselves while sliding toward inevitable doom. Lovecraft's texts provide no definitive answer, offering examples of both successful and failed applications of protective knowledge, victories that might be temporary delays, and survivals that might be entity indifference rather than human competence. The ambiguity is structural rather than accidental. To provide clear answers would be to violate the core principle that cosmic reality exceeds human comprehension. The weaknesses exist, the knowledge exists, the possibility of exploitation exists, yet the epistemic cost of utilizing any of these existences may exceed the value of survival purchased through such utilization. We can know, but knowing unmakes us. We can act, but action confirms our irrelevance. The protection is real and utterly inadequate simultaneously. Lovecraft's first published story, Dagon, from 1917, establishes vulnerability through the protagonist's escape rather than through any weakness in the entity itself. The narrator, a morphine-addicted survivor of a German U-boat attack, encounters a massive creature emerging from a primordial ocean after his lifeboat drifts into a region of seabed upheaved by volcanic activity. He flees in terror before the being can fully manifest, eventually reaching civilization but never recovering psychologically from what he witnessed. The story concludes with the narrator's impending suicide, suggesting that the only escape from cosmic horror is self-destruction. This earlier story establishes a pattern that Lovecraft would refine but never entirely abandon. Protagonists survive encounters not by exploiting monster weakness, but by retreating before full confrontation occurs. The entity in Dagon displays no vulnerability because the narrator never attempts resistance. His survival depends entirely on geographical distance and the creature's apparent lack of interest in pursuing him. This represents vulnerability through indifference. The monster could destroy him, but does not consider him significant enough to bother. The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, marks Lovecraft's first major articulation of exploitable cosmic vulnerability, alongside the famous declaration that the most merciful thing in the world is humanity's inability to correlate its knowledge. The story's three-part structure presents different characters encountering different aspects of Cthulhu's cult and the entity itself, each discovery building toward comprehensive but fragmentary understanding. The sculptor Wilcox's psychic sensitivity during Cthulhu's brief emergence creates mental illness, but also provides warning that something has disturbed cosmic order. Inspector Legrasse's raid on the Louisiana swamp cult reveals religious devotion to Great Cthulhu, along with partial information about the entity's nature and history. Finally, Sela Johansson's encounter with Cthulhu itself demonstrates both physical vulnerability and terrifying resilience. The interconnection between these narrative threads suggests that knowledge accumulates across multiple sources, that no single witness provides a complete picture, and that synthesis of fragmentary accounts enables understanding that might permit resistance, or at least inform flight. The Dreamland Cycle, the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, the Silver Key, and related stories establishes alternative dimensional frameworks where different rules govern vulnerability and protection. Randolph Carter navigates dream realms where elder signs provide protection, where certain gods can be bargained with, where knowledge of true names grants limited power. These stories operate according to logic more akin to traditional fantasy than cosmic horror, suggesting that vulnerability varies by dimensional context. Entities that seem invulnerable in material reality prove more susceptible in dream space, where thought and will carry greater weight than physical force. Yet this vulnerability in dreams creates its own dangers. Dreamers who die in dream space may not wake, or may wake transformed, their consciousness damaged by experiences that occurred in states where the mind lacks the body's protective separation from direct reality. The Elder Thing's vulnerability to Shoggoths in At the Mountains of Madness demonstrates that even highly advanced alien species face biological mortality, and the consequences of creating servitor races more adaptable than their creators. At the Mountains of Madness, Lovecraft's 1936 novella, provides extensive detail about the Elder Thing's civilization and their eventual defeat by their own creations. The Antarctic expedition discovers perfectly preserved specimens of beings who arrived on Earth millions of years ago, built vast cities, created life through biotechnology, and eventually succumbed to rebellion by their Shoggoth servants. The text describes how the Elder Things, despite their advanced science and formidable capabilities, proved vulnerable to climate change, to predation by the star spawn of Cthulhu, and ultimately to their own engineered organisms developing autonomous intelligence and turning against them. This represents perhaps Lovecraft's clearest statement that evolutionary and technological advancement do not eliminate vulnerability, but rather create new forms of it. The Elder Thing's downfall came not from external cosmic threat, but from internal biological processes they initiated but could not control. Their preserved cities stand as monuments to sophisticated civilization destroyed by its own success. The Shadow over Innsmouth, also from 1936, demonstrates that entities following recognizable biological patterns, eating, breathing, reproducing, possess corresponding biological vulnerabilities. The Deep Ones prove susceptible to explosives, firearms, and the federal raid that decimates their hybrid population in the coastal town. Yet this physical vulnerability coexists with genetic persistence. The narrator's own Deep One ancestry awakens despite his attempts to live normally, drawing him inexorably toward transformation and oceanic existence. The story suggests that biological vulnerability and biological inevitability are complementary rather than contradictory. Yes, Deep Ones can be killed by violence. Yes, their communities can be destroyed by organized military action. No, this does not prevent their species from continuing, from breeding with humans, from slowly transforming bloodlines across generations. The weakness is real, but strategically meaningless, permitting local victories while ensuring long-term persistence. The cross-referencing between stories creates cumulative mythology, where information fragments gradually coalesce into larger patterns. The Necronomicon appears first in The Hound, 1924, then gains increasing prominence through subsequent stories, each adding details about its contents, history, and the dangers of consultation. Elder signs are mentioned in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1927, then appear with protective function in multiple later works. Yog-Sothoth is named in The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, 1927, and becomes central to The Dunwich Horror, 1928. This accretion of mythological detail across works creates the impression of discovering ancient consistent cosmology rather than watching the author invent it story by story. The vulnerabilities documented in earlier tells inform protective measures attempted in later ones, building a sense that knowledge accumulates, that past encounters teach lessons applicable to future threats. Yet this apparent progress toward understanding is itself an illusion. The more characters know, the more endangered they become, and the accumulated knowledge never achieves comprehensive protection. This technique of distributed revelation through multiple texts allowed Lovecraft to maintain ambiguity about specific details while establishing clear patterns. No single story provides a complete catalog of Cthulhu's vulnerabilities, but reading across the mythos suggests imprisonment in Arlai, temporal constraints based on stellar alignment, and susceptibility to material damage that regenerates. Similarly, no single text fully explains the Elder Sign's function, but cumulative references establish it as a protective symbol of great antiquity, possibly originating with beings predating the Old Ones. The intertextual methodology mirrors actual mythological and religious texts, the Bible, the Vedas, Greek myths, which present information through multiple sources that complement, contradict, and complicate each other. Lovecraft's genius was recognizing that fictional mythology achieves authenticity through the same fragmentary, sometimes inconsistent presentation that characterizes actual mythology. Having established this foundation of earliest appearances and cross-story connections, we must now examine specific major works in detail, beginning with the story that most clearly demonstrates successful exploitation of cosmic vulnerability. The Dunwich Horror represents Lovecraft's most explicit exploration of cosmic vulnerability, successfully identified and exploited through textual research and correct ritual application. Published in 1929, the story depicts the Whately family's breeding experiment with Yog-Sothoth, producing twins, one mostly human, Wilbur, and one that remains hidden in the family farmhouse, growing to enormous proportions while remaining invisible to normal sight. The narrative establishes vulnerability from its opening sections. Wilbur Whately's hybrid nature grants him powers far beyond human capacity, yet also marks him as an aberration that cannot survive indefinitely in human society. His death occurs not through heroic confrontation, but through an accident. Attempting to steal the Miskatonic University Library's Latin Necronomicon, he is mauled by a guard dog, and his dying body reveals his true nature to horrified witnesses. The vulnerability here is environmental. Wilbur possesses formidable abilities, but operates in a world fundamentally hostile to his existence, where even routine actions like library theft carry disproportionate risk because his hybrid biology cannot withstand conventional physical trauma. The story's second half shifts focus to Wilbur's twin, who escapes the farmhouse after the younger Whately's death and begins devastating the Dunwich countryside. Lovecraft describes the creature as bigger than a barn and capable of leaving footprints as big as a hogshead while remaining invisible except when dust or spray reveals its outline. The invisibility creates a tactical advantage. How does one fight what cannot be seen, but also establishes the creature's fundamental weakness? It exists simultaneously in multiple dimensional states, not fully manifested in our reality. This liminal existence makes it difficult to perceive, but also suggests incomplete presence, that it remains tethered to other dimensions and might be severed from material reality through proper intervention. Dr. Armitage recognizes this possibility after intensive research, declaring that the creature can't last much longer at best due to the instability of its dimensional positioning. The vulnerability is temporal and ontological. The longer it manifests, the more unstable its presence becomes. Dr. Armitage's research methodology deserves careful examination as a model for how protective knowledge functions in Lovecraft's cosmos. He does not rely solely on the Necronomicon, but cross-references it with other forbidden texts, comparing Latin and Greek versions, consulting colleagues about astronomical alignments mentioned in ancient manuscripts. The story emphasizes that this research exacts psychological cost. There were traces of terror behind the librarian's eager bearing and descriptions of how the investigation ages him visibly. The knowledge he acquires includes not just the banishment formula, but comprehensive understanding of what the Whately twins represent. Attempts to open gateways for the old one's return, biological experiments in creating entities capable of existing simultaneously in multiple dimensional frameworks. This complete understanding proves necessary for the formula to work. Simply reading words without comprehending their cosmic context would fail. The vulnerability can only be exploited by those who have damaged themselves through the research required to identify it. The climactic banishment scene on Sentinel Hill demonstrates Lovecraft's characteristic ambiguity about whether protective measures genuinely work or merely align with cosmic timing that makes them appear effective. Armitage and his colleagues, Rice and Morgan, position themselves with the creature visible through powder spray, while Armitage reads the dismissal formula from the Necronomicon. The text describes the creature becoming visible and audible in its death throes, screaming Yog-Sothoth repeatedly as it dissolves. The witnesses observe its true form before it vanishes, a mass of tentacles, eyes, and mouths, recognizably related to Wilbur's revealed anatomy, but vastly larger. The banishment succeeds, and the Dunwich crisis ends. Yet the story provides no clear explanation of mechanism. Does the formula sever the creature's connection to our dimension, or was it already dying from the instability Armitage mentioned, with the ritual merely accelerating inevitable dissolution? The narrative deliberately leaves this uncertain. The thematic significance of this victory extends beyond the immediate plot. The Dunwich horror establishes that monsters created through summoning can be dismissed through corresponding formulas, that the same texts containing dangerous knowledge also contain defensive knowledge, that proper research and preparation enable human agency against cosmic threats. Yet the story simultaneously undermines this apparent empowerment. The defense worked because the threat was hybrid and unstable, because the right resources happened to be available at the right location, because 3 men possessed sufficient knowledge and courage to attempt the ritual. Remove any single factor, and Dunwich falls. The creature continues devastating the countryside, and the gateway the Whately family attempted to open might eventually succeed. The vulnerability exists, but remains context-dependent, requiring alignment of circumstances that cannot be guaranteed or replicated. The cost of victory receives relatively little explicit attention in the story's conclusion, but operates as persistent subtext. Armitage has read and comprehended sections of the Necronomicon that permanently alter his understanding of reality. He knows what Wilbur Whately attempted, what the creature represented, what might have emerged had the experiment succeeded. This knowledge cannot be unknown, and the story implies it haunts him. Rice and Morgan witness the creature's true form before banishment. The text emphasizes their terror, noting that what they saw made them afraid to ask any more questions. They survive physically intact, but psychologically marked by revelation of what hybrid biology and dimensional overlap can produce. The 3 men saved Dunwich and possibly prevented wider catastrophe, yet the narrative presents no triumph or celebration, only weary relief that this particular crisis has passed while cosmic threat continues indefinitely. The broader implications for Lovecraft's mythos became significant through this story's influence on subsequent writers. The Dunwich horror demonstrated that cosmic horror need not be entirely hopeless, that human action could matter in specific local contexts, even while remaining cosmically insignificant. This opened narrative possibilities that pure indifferentism would preclude, allowing writers to construct stories where protagonists meaningfully resist rather than passively witness. Yet Lovecraft carefully limited this agency through multiple constraints. The knowledge required is dangerous. The circumstances must align favorably. The victory remains local rather than cosmic, and the psychological cost approaches the value of success. The vulnerability is real, exploitable, and ultimately insufficient for any comprehensive defense against the universe's true nature. The Call of Cthulhu, published in 1928, remains Lovecraft's most analyzed work, partly because it presents cosmic vulnerability at its most philosophically ambiguous, offering multiple forms of weakness while simultaneously suggesting those weaknesses mean nothing on cosmic timescales. The story's famous opening declares that humanity's salvation lies in our inability to correlate the contents of our knowledge, that comprehensive understanding would drive us mad or cause us to flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. This framing establishes that the story concerns dangerous knowledge as much as dangerous entities, that the true horror lies not in Cthulhu itself, but in what understanding Cthulhu implies about reality's nature. The vulnerability documented throughout the narrative operates within this framework. Yes, Cthulhu can apparently be damaged, but that damage may be cosmically meaningless, and the knowledge required to understand even temporary weakness corrodes human meaning-making capacity. The story's tripartite structure presents three independent investigations that gradually reveal overlapping truth about Cthulhu's cult and the entity's brief emergence. The first section describes sculptor Henry Anthony Wilcox's psychic sensitivity during March 1925, when he experiences vivid dreams of cyclopean cities, of titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, and produces clay bas-reliefs depicting strange geometries and a squatting tentacled figure. His psychological crisis coincides precisely with documented seismic disturbances and reports of mass unease among sensitive individuals worldwide. The vulnerability suggested here is perceptual. Cthulhu's stirring in R'lyeh produces effects detectable by human consciousness, creating warning signs that something has changed in cosmic order. This represents inverse of typical vulnerability. Instead of humans finding monster weakness, the monster's very existence creates psychic turbulence that alerts potential victims to danger. Yet this warning provides no defense. Wilcox cannot protect himself from the dreams, and the knowledge they impart serves only to mark him as having been touched by something beyond normal human experience. The second section, Inspector Legrasse's encounter with the Louisiana swamp cult in 1907, provides extensive detail about Cthulhu worship and the entity's history. The cultists, caught performing human sacrifice rituals, speak of great Cthulhu sleeping in R'lyeh beneath the Pacific, waiting until the stars are right for emergence and reclamation of Earth. An ancient sailor from Greenland provides translation and context, explaining that the cult maintains knowledge transmitted across millennia about entities that came from the stars and will return when proper cosmic alignments occur. The vulnerability documented here is temporal and astronomical. Cthulhu cannot emerge at will, but remains constrained by celestial mechanics beyond anyone's control. This represents the bleakest form of weakness. Humanity survives not through any action we take, but through cosmic accident, because we happen to exist during a period when stellar configurations prevent full manifestation. The cultists' devotion persists despite or because of this temporal constraint, their worship maintaining connection across eons until favorable conditions return. The third and climactic section presents Johansson's manuscript describing the alert's encounter with newly risen R'lyeh in March 1925, during the same period of Wilcox's disturbed dreams. The Norwegian crew discovers a coastline of mingled mud, ooze, and weedy Cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than the tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of R'lyeh. The city's geometry violates Euclidean principles, with angles and surfaces that seem wrong to human perception, causing psychological distress through mere observation. When Cthulhu emerges from the temple, described as a mountain that walked or stumbled, Johansen makes the desperate decision to ram the alert through the entity's head. Lovecraft's description emphasizes both the action's apparent effectiveness and its ultimate futility. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansen drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 opened graves, and a sound that the chronicler could not put on paper. The critical question becomes whether this collision genuinely harmed Cthulhu or merely inconvenienced it. The text describes immediate regeneration. The entity's substance reunited after the vessel passed through it, the damage repairing instantly. Cthulhu pursues the alert briefly before apparently losing interest or choosing not to continue the chase. Johansen escapes, though most of his crew dies during the encounter or its aftermath. Lovecraft provides no definitive interpretation of what occurred. Did the physical trauma genuinely hurt Cthulhu, causing pain or damage that encouraged retreat? Did the entity recognize that the stars were not yet right for full emergence and voluntarily return to its death sleep? Or did it simply ignore the insects that disturbed it, considering them too insignificant for sustained attention? The narrative deliberately preserves all three possibilities, refusing resolution that would answer the vulnerability question definitively. The material vulnerability demonstrated by the steamboat collision has generated decades of interpretive debate among scholars and fans. Some argue it reveals that Cthulhu, despite cosmic significance, possesses physical substance subject to physical forces, that it can be hurt, implying it can potentially be killed through sufficient application of conventional violence. Others note the immediate regeneration suggests conventional damage means nothing to beings operating under alien biological principles where destruction and reformation occur simultaneously. A third interpretation proposes that the collision succeeded not through physical damage, but through disrupting Cthulhu's dimensional manifestation, that ramming the yacht through the entity severed its incomplete emergence, forcing premature return to Orgolia's depths. Each interpretation finds textual support, and Lovecraft's refusal to clarify suggests he intended this ambiguity, wanted readers uncertain whether human action achieved anything meaningful or merely coincided with the entity's own decision-making, according to factors we cannot comprehend. The temporal weakness, when the stars are right, operates as the story's most significant vulnerability and most terrifying limitation on human agency. Cthulhu's imprisonment in R'lyeh depends not on human seals or protective magic, but on astronomical configurations that cycle across incomprehensible timescales. The entity stirs occasionally when conditions approach, but do not quite reach the necessary alignment, creating the psychic disturbances documented through Wilcox and others. Eventually, inevitably, the stars will achieve correct positioning, and Cthulhu will emerge fully with nothing humanity can do to prevent it. This represents cosmic horror's essential principle. We survive through astronomical accident, not merit or effort, and that accident will eventually end. The vulnerability is real. Cthulhu genuinely cannot emerge during wrong stellar configurations, but it provides no path to safety, only temporary reprieve before inevitable doom. The story concludes with narrator Thurston compiling his uncle's research and Johansen's manuscript, achieving comprehensive understanding that confirms his own death sentence. He writes, I've looked upon all that the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and the flowers of summer must ever afterward be poison to me. The knowledge of Cthulhu's nature, the understanding of humanity's cosmic insignificance, the awareness that our survival depends on stellar timing rather than our own actions. These revelations destroy meaning in existence even while leaving Thurston physically alive. He survives the knowledge acquisition but cannot survive with it, expecting death from either cult action or psychological collapse. The vulnerability has been documented, the entity has been temporarily damaged or dismissed, yet the investigator who achieved this understanding has been destroyed by it. The pattern established here, that documenting monster weakness costs more than the documentation is worth, became foundational for subsequent cosmic horror. The Call of Cthulhu thus presents vulnerability as simultaneously real and irrelevant, exploitable and meaningless, offering both hope for resistance and confirmation that resistance cannot ultimately matter. The ambiguity is structural, essential to Lovecraft's philosophical project, and would influence every subsequent engagement with his mythology. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology represents the most influential and controversial elaboration of cosmic vulnerability, transforming suggestive fragments into explicit cosmology with clearly defined weaknesses and oppositions. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth appointed himself guardian and interpreter of the mythos, publishing stories that introduced what became known as the elemental theory, the concept that the old ones could be classified according to elemental affinities, earth, air, fire, water, and that corresponding elder gods opposed them in cosmic struggle between good and evil. This framework imposed order and moral structure onto Lovecraft's deliberately amoral cosmos, creating exploitable vulnerabilities through opposition. Water-affiliated entities like Cthulhu became vulnerable to fire-affiliated forces, while air beings could be countered through earth-based protections. Derleth's 1945 story, The Lurker at the Threshold, and his completion of Lovecraft's fragments established this system, making cosmic horror more comprehensible and therefore more conventionally defeatable. Scholars and purists have spent decades criticizing this systematization as fundamental betrayal of Lovecraft's philosophy, yet Derleth's approach became widely influential, shaping how subsequent generations understood mythos entities and their weaknesses. The commercialization of cosmic horror through Derleth's Arkham House publishing and later through role-playing games, comic books, and mass-market fiction necessitated more beatable monsters than Lovecraft's originals provided. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, required mechanical systems for combat, damage, and entity defeat, fundamentally incompatible with pure cosmic indifferentism, where human action means nothing. The game's solution involved creating statistical representations of entities with hit points, armor values, and specific vulnerabilities, while maintaining the narrative frame that these beings are cosmically overwhelming. A Shoggoth might have 150 hit points and require multiple investigators working cooperatively to destroy, but it can be destroyed through sufficient dynamite or firepower. This ludic necessity transformed Lovecraft's ambiguous vulnerabilities into concrete game mechanics, influencing how subsequent writers and fans understood entity weakness. The game's extraordinary commercial success, spanning decades and multiple editions, meant that millions encountered Lovecraftian entities first through gaming contexts where defeating monsters constitutes fundamental gameplay, not through reading Lovecraft's philosophically complex original texts. Robert Bloch, one of Lovecraft's correspondents who continued writing mythos fiction after his death, explored psychological and human-scale vulnerabilities rather than Derleth's cosmic systematization. Bloch's stories like The Shambler from the Stars, 1935, and The Shadow from the Steeple, 1950, emphasized that entities dependent on human summoning or worship could be weakened by eliminating their cults, destroying their texts, or preventing their manifestation rituals. This approach maintained Lovecraft's materialist framework while suggesting that human knowledge and action could meaningfully interfere with cosmic horror at the point of intersection with human reality. Bloch's vulnerability concept centered on prevention rather than confrontation, stopping summonings before they completed, interrupting rituals, eliminating cult knowledge. This represented more philosophically defensible expansion of Lovecraft's ideas than Derleth's good versus evil cosmology, acknowledging cosmic indifference while granting humans capacity to at least delay or localize horror's manifestation. Clark Ashton Smith's contributions to the mythos introduced different dimensional rules that created alternative vulnerability frameworks. His Hyperborea, Zothique, and Averoigne cycles presented worlds where magic operated reliably according to consistent principles, where protective spells genuinely worked, and where sorcerers could bind or banish entities through proper ritual. Smith's prose style, ornate, archaic, deliberately excessive, created atmospheres closer to high fantasy than cosmic horror, and his entity vulnerabilities reflected this aesthetic. The entities in Smith's mythos stories could be defeated through superior sorcery, outwitted through clever manipulation, or avoided through proper protective measures. This diverged sharply from Lovecraft's skepticism about magic's effectiveness, yet Smith's approach demonstrated the mythos's flexibility, its capacity to accommodate different authorial visions while maintaining recognizable mythological framework. The collaboration between authors with distinct philosophical and aesthetic commitments created textual richness through contradiction rather than consistency. Ramsey Campbell's innovations in British weird fiction brought generational and evolutionary concepts to cosmic horror vulnerability. His stories, set in the Severn Valley region, introduced the idea that entities might change across time, that contemporary manifestations might differ from ancient forms, and that biological or mimetic evolution could alter both entity capacity and exploitable weakness. Campbell's The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, and subsequent stories suggested that cosmic forces adapting to modern human consciousness might develop new vulnerabilities while losing old ones, creating arms race between human understanding and alien adaptation. This dynamic approach to vulnerability reflected mid-20th century engagement with evolutionary biology and information theory, updating Lovecraft's essentially static cosmology with modern scientific frameworks. The entities remained fundamentally alien and threatening, but operated within evolutionary principles that made them subject to change, adaptation, and therefore ongoing vulnerability. Modern interpreters like S.T. Joshi, Caitlin R. Kiernan, and Laird Barron have approached vulnerability questions through more philosophically sophisticated frameworks than earlier generations. Joshi's scholarly work emphasizes Lovecraft's mechanistic materialism, arguing that entity vulnerabilities must be understood as consistent with physical law rather than magical thinking, that Cthulhu can be damaged by steamboat precisely because it possesses material form subject to kinetic force, not because of any mystical weakness. Kiernan's fiction explores how human perception and consciousness might constitute both vulnerability and weapon, that entities existing partially in human psychological space can be affected by collective belief or refusal to believe. Barron's The Imago Sequence and other works present cosmic horror as information hazard, where the vulnerability lies not in entities themselves, but in human cognitive architecture's susceptibility to certain patterns of data. These contemporary approaches maintain Lovecraft's core philosophical concerns while incorporating insights from cognitive science, information theory, and modern physics. The wikification problem deserves attention as phenomenon affecting how vulnerability information circulates in contemporary culture. Online encyclopedias, fan wikis, and collaborative databases have created comprehensive catalogs of mythos entities with detailed entries listing appearance, abilities, and weaknesses as if documenting real biological species. The Cthulhu Wiki, the SCP Foundation's Lovecraft-influenced entries, and countless fan sites present definitively what Lovecraft kept ambiguous, transforming mystery into taxonomy. These resources serve useful functions for writers, game masters, and fans seeking quick reference, but they fundamentally alter engagement with cosmic horror. What Lovecraft presented as fragmentary, contested knowledge requiring dangerous research becomes instantly accessible Wikipedia-style information. The vulnerability that required reading the Necronomicon at cost of sanity now requires only web browser and search terms. This democratization of forbidden knowledge removes the epistemological horror that made vulnerability documentation dangerous, transforming cosmic horror into fantasy world building where comprehensive enemy stat blocks are expected rather than philosophically problematic. The collaborative expansion of Lovecraft's vulnerability concepts across nearly a century demonstrates remarkable flexibility in his core mythology while revealing tensions between philosophical rigor and commercial accessibility. Each generation of writers has negotiated differently between Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism and narrative structures requiring protagonist agency. Some, like Derleth, resolved the tension by abandoning indifferentism for conventional morality. Others, like Bloch and Campbell, found middle ground where human action matters locally while remaining cosmically insignificant. Contemporary writers increasingly engage with vulnerability as epistemological and informational problem rather than purely physical phenomenon. Through all these iterations, the fundamental questions persist. Are cosmic entities genuinely vulnerable, or do we merely tell stories as if they must be? Does documenting weakness provide protection or illusion of protection? Can knowledge save us or only ensure we understand precisely why we cannot be saved? These literary manifestations and their evolution across authors and decades have generated cultural afterlife, extending far beyond fiction into games, films, music, and genuine subcultural practices, phenomena we must now examine to understand how fictional vulnerability became real cultural force. The boundary between fictional Lovecraftian vulnerability and purported real-world protective practice has eroded considerably since the 1970s, when occult revival movements began treating the mythos as legitimate magical tradition rather than literary creation. Online forums dedicated to chaos magic, left-hand path traditions, and experimental occultism contain extensive discussions debating the real, protective properties of elder signs, proper pronunciation of banishment formulas, and whether Lovecraft channeled genuine cosmic knowledge or invented convincing fiction. Reddit's occult communities, Discord servers for practitioners, and specialty websites host debates about which elder sign configuration provides authentic protection. The tree branch pattern described in some sources, the star and eye design popularized by Nyarlathotep, or entirely different symbols practitioners claim to have received through gnosis or dream revelation. These discussions occur with remarkable seriousness, participants treating Lovecraft's invented mythology with the same reverence and analytical rigor applied to historically documented magical systems like the Golden Dawn's Lesser Banishing Ritual or Solomonic Pentacle construction. The Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977 and claiming to be translation of authentic text rather than Lovecraft's invention, represents the most commercially successful conflation of fictional and purported real magical practice. The book, almost certainly a hoax created by occultist Peter Lavender, working with Simon as pseudonym, presents detailed rituals for summoning and banishing entities from a synthesized Lovecraft Sumerian tradition, complete with protective formulas, gate-walking meditations, and warnings about psychological danger. Generations of practitioners have used these rituals despite or because of their dubious authenticity, reporting various results ranging from profound spiritual experiences to psychological disturbances to absolutely nothing. The text's protective measures include extensive preliminary purification, construction of protective circles using specific geometric configurations, and invocations of elder gods positioned as benevolent forces opposing the old ones, a framework lifted directly from Nyarlathotep's systematization. Whether these protections work becomes a philosophically interesting question. If practitioners believe they work and experience subjective sense of safety or power, does the fictional origin matter? The Simon Necronomicon transformed Lovecraft's literary devices into operational magical technology, however questionable that operation might be. Urban legends about people attempting protective rituals and experiencing terrifying results circulate through creepypasta communities, paranormal forums, and occult discussion boards. These narratives typically follow a pattern. Someone experiments with Lovecraftian summoning from curiosity or skepticism, discovers that something responds, then desperately seeks protective formulas to dismiss what they've inadvertently called. The stories emphasize that elder signs carved into door frames seem to prevent entry, that speaking banishment phrases in correct phonetic approximation cause phenomena to cease, that destroying cult materials eliminated ongoing disturbances. These accounts, whether genuine experiences misinterpreted through Lovecraftian framework or entirely fabricated, serve social function within occult communities. They reinforce group belief that the mythology contains real power while providing cautionary tales about the dangers of unprepared experimentation. The protective measures become real through collective agreement and repeated narrative performance, regardless of their fictional origins or actual efficacy against anything beyond psychological suggestion and social expectation. Chaos magic practitioners since the 1980s have deliberately employed Lovecraftian entities as servitors, egregores, or thought forms, while incorporating corresponding protective measures into their practice. The chaos magic paradigm, articulated by Peter Carroll, Phil Hine, and others holds that belief is tool rather than truth, that magical systems work because practitioners invest them with psychological and symbolic power rather than because they access objective, metaphysical reality. From this perspective, Lovecraft's elder signs function protectively because generations of readers have invested them with protective significance, creating collective thought form with real psychological effects. Chaos magicians report using elder sign tattoos, amulets, and visualizations as genuine protective devices during ritual work, invoking mythos entities for various purposes. The practice acknowledges fictional origin while asserting that fiction becomes functionally real through sustained collective engagement. This approach dissolves the question of whether Lovecraftian vulnerabilities are real by reframing reality itself as participatory and consensus-based, rather than objective and independent. The phenomenon of protective tattoos and jewelry, elder signs, specific symbols from Lovecraft's descriptions, quotations from his texts, has expanded from occult subcultures into broader geek culture and fashion. People who may have no interest in actual magical practice wear elder sign pendants or display the symbols as tattoos, sometimes for aesthetic reasons, but often with half-serious protective intention. The logic mirrors historical, talismanic tradition. Wearing symbol associated with protection might provide actual protection, or at minimum, provide psychological comfort. Online marketplaces like Etsy feature hundreds of vendors selling elder sign jewelry, protective amulets, and wearable Necronomicon symbols, with product descriptions that carefully walk the line between fictional fandom and genuine spiritual significance. Customer reviews sometimes describe feeling safer or more protected while wearing these items, creating feedback loop where commercial products designed for entertainment merchandise acquire genuine protective significance through user attribution and experience. The philosophical question underlying all these practices becomes whether belief in Lovecraftian protective measures constitutes legitimate magical working, delusional thinking, or sophisticated psychological technology for managing existential anxiety. If someone carves an elder sign into their doorframe and subsequently feels protected from cosmic horror, has the protection worked? The answer depends entirely on what we mean by worked and protection. The symbol will not physically stop any material threat, obviously, but if it reduces anxiety, enables sleep, provides sense of agency against overwhelming cosmic meaninglessness, then it has performed psychological function that might be the only function protection ever performs. Lovecraft's genius was creating mythological framework flexible enough to accommodate this ambiguity. His protective measures are fictional, yes, but they address real human need for defensive ritual against chaos and meaninglessness. The cultural persistence of these practices suggests that fictional vulnerability and fictional protection can become functionally real through collective belief and individual psychological investment. The fundamental challenge facing any Lovecraft adaptation lies in translating cosmic indifferentism, entities that cannot be meaningfully fought or defeated, into visual media formats that typically demand climactic confrontations and resolution. The earliest film attempts largely abandoned Lovecraft's philosophical core in favor of conventional monster movie structures where creatures could be destroyed through fire, explosives, or heroic sacrifice. Roger Corman's 1963 film, The Haunted Palace, loosely based on the case of Charles Dexter Ward, transforms Lovecraft's psychological horror into gothic melodrama, where the possessed protagonist can be stopped through conventional means. Stuart Gordon's Reanimator, 1985, and From Beyond, 1986, embrace body horror and mad science rather than cosmic dread, presenting entities that can be fought, damaged, and destroyed through improvised weapons and desperate action. These adaptations succeeded as entertaining horror films while fundamentally betraying Lovecraft's vision, proving that mainstream cinema's commercial requirements remain incompatible with genuine cosmic horror unless significant compromises transform vulnerability from philosophical problem into practical plot device. The 2005 silent film adaptation of The Call of Cthulhu by the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society represents rare attempt at philosophical fidelity regarding vulnerability and human insignificance. Produced as if it were a 1920s silent film using period-appropriate techniques, the adaptation presents Cthulhu as fundamentally undefeatable. The steamboat collision accomplishes nothing permanent, and the entity's return to Rolia occurs through cosmic timing rather than human action. The film's low-budget and deliberately archaic style paradoxically enabled greater fidelity to source material than expensive Hollywood productions could achieve, since it eliminated audience expectation for spectacular monster battles or heroic victories. The investigators survive through retreat and cosmic accident, precisely as in Lovecraft's story, and the film's conclusion emphasizes the temporary nature of humanity's reprieve. This adaptation demonstrated that faithful Lovecraft could work cinematically, but required accepting commercial limitations. The film found audience through cult distribution and horror festivals rather than theatrical release. John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, while not direct Lovecraft adaptation, engages seriously with cosmic horror's epistemological implications, including the question of vulnerability itself. The film's reality-bending narrative suggests that entities from fiction are becoming real through readers' collective belief, and that conventional concepts of weakness or defeat become meaningless when reality itself proves mutable and author-controlled. The protagonist's attempts to resist or fight the emerging cosmic horror fail not because monsters are too strong, but because the framework within which fighting and winning have meaning is dissolving. Carpenter understands that true Lovecraftian vulnerability operates at ontological level. The weakness isn't in the monster, but in the concept of stable reality, where monsters and humans occupy separate categories. The film presents no protective measures, no weaknesses to exploit, because it recognizes that Lovecraft's real horror lies in discovering that the universe doesn't operate according to rules that permit human agency. Gaming adaptations face even more severe structural challenges, since gameplay fundamentally requires player agency and achievable victory conditions. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu tabletop role-playing game, first published in 1981 and still in production through 8th edition, negotiated this tension by emphasizing investigation over combat, making winning synonymous with survival and escape rather than monster defeat, and implementing the sanity mechanic, where confronting cosmic horror damages player characters psychologically, even when they survive physically. The game's most effective scenarios present entities with documented weaknesses, specific rituals to dismiss them, environmental conditions that constrain them, or time limits before they fully manifest, while emphasizing that fighting mythos entities directly leads to character death or madness. This framework allows gameplay while maintaining something of Lovecraft's philosophy. Yes, the cultists can be stopped and the summoning prevented, but the cosmic entities themselves remain fundamentally beyond player character capacity to truly defeat. Video games demonstrate the full spectrum of approaches to Lovecraftian vulnerability. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002, implemented sanity effects that broke the fourth wall. The game would fake delete save files, display false error messages, or pretend to crash, creating meta-textual horror where players questioned what was real within and outside the game. Yet it ultimately presented defeatable boss monsters with visible health bars, compromising cosmic horror for conventional gameplay. Bloodborne, 2015, achieved remarkable balance by presenting eldritch entities as killable bosses while maintaining atmosphere, suggesting that killing them doesn't matter cosmically. The hunter succeeds in immediate combat, but the game's conclusion implies that cosmic horror persists regardless. The game's lore reveals that understanding grants power over entities, but also transforms the understander into something alien, that ascending to higher states of consciousness means becoming the horror. The most philosophically interesting choice. The game never explains its mechanics as protective measures, leaving players uncertain whether their success derives from character ability, cosmic indifference, or dream logic, where victory and defeat are equally illusory. Music's engagement with Lovecraftian themes naturally focuses more on atmosphere and philosophical implications than specific vulnerability mechanics. Yet several subgenres have explored the concept through lyrical content and aesthetic choices. Death metal bands like Portal and Abyssal employ deliberately obscure production, unintelligible vocals, and dissonant compositions to evoke overwhelming cosmic force that cannot be comprehended or resisted. The music itself becomes sonic representation of entities without weakness. German band Sulfur Aeon takes different approach, with albums like Gateway to the Antisphere telling narrative arcs about underwater temples, rising horrors, and desperate human attempts at protective ritual that might delay but never prevent emergence. Their lyrics reference specific Lovecraftian vulnerability concepts, elder signs, geometric wards, banishment formulas, while maintaining ambiguity about whether these measures achieve anything beyond providing narrative structure to songs about inevitable doom. The black metal subgenre has particularly embraced Lovecraftian aesthetics, with bands incorporating cosmic horror themes into already established traditions of bleakness and human insignificance. The musical emphasis on overwhelming sonic assault, tremolo-picked riffs creating wall of sound effects, and blast beats generating relentless pressure mirrors the experience Lovecraft described encountering entities too vast for comprehension. Where traditional metal often emphasizes power and aggression, suggesting capacity to fight, cosmic horror metal emphasizes helplessness and inevitability. The vulnerability exists. Songs describe it. Lyrics reference protective measures from Lovecraft's texts, but the music itself undermines any sense that vulnerability matters or can be exploited. The sonic experience communicates what Lovecraft's prose established. Understanding weakness provides no comfort when the weak thing remains infinitely more powerful than the understander. These adaptations across media demonstrate persistent tension between Lovecraft's philosophical vision and commercial entertainment requirements. Films need climaxes, games need victory conditions, Music needs structure, all of which potentially compromise cosmic indifferentism. Yet the most successful adaptations find ways to acknowledge vulnerability while maintaining essential horror. Yes, the monster can be temporarily stopped, but cosmic threat persists. Yes, the protagonist survives, but survival doesn't constitute victory. Yes, protective measures exist, but employing them costs everything that makes survival worthwhile. The vulnerability becomes real, yet insufficient, documented, yet inadequate, a compromise between artistic integrity and commercial viability that mirrors Lovecraft's own negotiations with pulp magazine requirements. Academic horror studies has increasingly treated Lovecraft's vulnerability concepts as serious philosophical material worthy of sustained scholarly attention, with particular focus on how entity weaknesses expose tensions between materialist worldview and narrative structure. S.T. Joshi's extensive biographical and critical work establishes that Lovecraft's mechanistic materialism required cosmic entities to possess physical properties and therefore physical limitations, that vulnerability represents not thematic betrayal but philosophical necessity within consistently materialist framework. Critics like China Miéville and Mark Fisher have explored how Lovecraft's monsters embody capitalist modernity's anxieties about forces too vast to comprehend or resist, where documented weaknesses serve as comforting fiction, masking the reality that systemic threats possess no exploitable vulnerability. Graduate seminars at universities increasingly examine Lovecraft through lenses of posthumanism, speculative realism, and object-oriented ontology, philosophical movements finding in his work anticipations of contemporary thinking about non-human agency and the limits of anthropocentric knowledge. The vulnerability question becomes, if entities exist independent of human observation with properties we cannot fully comprehend, can our documentation of their weaknesses be anything more than anthropocentric projection? Philosophy departments have adopted Lovecraftian scenarios as thought experiments for exploring epistemological limits and the relationship between knowledge and harm. Thomas Ligotti's essay collection, The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, uses Lovecraft extensively while arguing that the most terrifying weakness is consciousness itself, that human self-awareness constitutes vulnerability, making us susceptible to cosmic horror that unconscious beings would simply ignore. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet trilogy employs Lovecraft to examine what he calls the world without us, reality that exists independent of human presence or comprehension. From this perspective, entity vulnerabilities documented in texts represent human cognitive frameworks imposed on phenomena that exceed those frameworks. We see weakness because human minds require narrative structures involving vulnerability and potential defeat. The philosophical appropriation suggests that Lovecraft's real contribution lies not in creating vulnerable monsters, but in revealing that vulnerability and invulnerability are human categories inadequate for describing truly alien existence. Religious studies scholars have compared Lovecraftian protective measures to apotropaic magic traditions across cultures, noting structural similarities between elder signs and protective symbols from ancient Near Eastern, Egyptian, and European folk practices. The pentagram, the Eye of Horus, the Hamsa hand, Sator squares, hex signs, all function as geometric or symbolic barriers against malevolent forces, operating through principles Lovecraft essentially replicated in fictional form. The academic interest lies in what this reveals about human psychological need for protective ritual, regardless of empirical efficacy. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss's work on mythological structures finds parallel in how Lovecraft created mythology, incorporating its own internal protection mechanisms, suggesting deep-seated cognitive requirement that any system of cosmic threat must include corresponding defensive measures, or human minds reject the system as unbearable. The protective symbols work not through supernatural efficacy, but through providing cognitive and emotional tools for managing existential anxiety. Function they perform equally, whether historically transmitted or recently invented by Rhode Island writer. Psychology has found particularly rich material in examining why humans desperately seek and catalog monster weaknesses, even when those weaknesses provide no practical utility. Terror management theory, developed by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Pyszczynski, proposes that humans cope with death awareness through cultural worldviews, providing meaning and symbolic immortality. Lovecraftian vulnerability documentation serves precisely this function. By identifying and systematizing monster weaknesses, fans and scholars create framework suggesting cosmic horror can be understood, categorized, and theoretically defeated. The wikis, encyclopedias, and comprehensive guides to mythos entities represent psychological defense mechanisms against meaninglessness, ways of asserting human capacity to comprehend and potentially control what Lovecraft designed to be incomprehensible and uncontrollable. The compulsive documentation becomes symptom of the very anthropocentric thinking Lovecraft critiqued, proving that even readers who understand his philosophy cannot emotionally accept it without creating protective structures of knowledge and categorization. Fan communities demonstrate this psychology through obsessive hierarchical ranking of entities by power level, extensive debates about which protective measures work against which threats, and creation of comprehensive databases cataloging every reference to vulnerability across decades of collaborative fiction. The Cthulhu Wiki, the Lovecraft Encyclopedia, and specialized forums contain thousands of pages analyzing cosmic entities with seriousness typically reserved for actual biological species or historical phenomena. These communities argue passionately about whether Cthulhu could defeat Azathoth in direct confrontation, what weaknesses the King in Yellow possesses compared to Nyarlathotep, whether elder signs function against all old ones or only specific ones. The discussions reveal desperate need to impose order, hierarchy, and comprehensibility on mythology specifically designed to resist such ordering. This represents adaptive coping mechanism, taking cosmic horror's weapons and transforming them into fantasy world building where everything can be known, ranked, and theoretically defeated given sufficient preparation and knowledge. The rationalist fiction movement, exemplified by Eliezer Yudkowsky's Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality and similar works, has turned attention toward Lovecraftian scenarios with explicit goal of demonstrating that no entity, however alien, can be truly immune to scientific method and rational analysis. These texts propose that cosmic horror persists only through protagonists' failure to think clearly, experiment systematically, and apply proper epistemological rigor. From this perspective, Lovecraft's entities possess weaknesses that competent rationalists could identify and exploit. Cthulhu is a biological organism subject to thermodynamics and can therefore be destroyed through sufficient energy application. The MIGO use technology that can be reverse engineered. Yog-Sothoth exists according to physical laws that can be discovered and manipulated. This approach treats Lovecraft's horror as puzzle to be solved rather than existential condition to be endured, fundamentally reframing vulnerability from philosophical question to engineering problem. The rationalist appropriation reveals contemporary Silicon Valley optimism that technology and reason can overcome any obstacle, cosmic horror included, a belief Lovecraft would have found both admirable and pathetically naive. The SCP Foundation collaborative writing project represents perhaps the most extensive subcultural appropriation of Lovecraftian vulnerability concepts, transforming cosmic horror into bureaucratic procedure and containment protocol. The Foundation's wiki contains thousands of entries describing anomalous entities, objects, and phenomena, along with detailed special containment procedures designed to neutralize or manage them. Many entries are explicitly Lovecraftian, but even those that aren't operate according to principles Lovecraft established. Entities possess specific properties. Those properties create vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities can be identified through research and exploited through proper methodology. The SCP format, clinical documentation style, emphasis on containment rather than destruction, acknowledgement that many entities cannot be defeated, only managed, allows cosmic horror to coexist with human agency. The project's enormous popularity demonstrates appetite for Lovecraftian horror that acknowledges entity power while granting humans capacity for systematic, institutional response. The vulnerability becomes bureaucratized, transformed from individual hero, discovering weakness, into organizational knowledge accumulated across facilities and personnel. These academic and subcultural appropriations reveal that Lovecraft's fictional vulnerabilities have become cultural framework for processing real anxieties about uncontrollable forces, climate change, algorithmic systems, political chaos, technological acceleration. We catalog monster weaknesses because we desperately need to believe that incomprehensible threats possess exploitable flaws, that sufficient research will reveal vulnerabilities, that knowledge and preparation can protect us. The fact that these are fictional monsters with fictional weaknesses makes the cataloging psychologically safe, while allowing practice of cognitive habits we hope will apply to actual threats. The cultural persistence of Lovecraftian vulnerability documentation suggests deep human need for protective knowledge, even when, especially when, we suspect that knowledge provides no genuine protection. The persistent human need to identify and catalog monster weaknesses reveals something profound about our species' cognitive architecture and its limitations when confronting genuine existential threat. Psychological research on threat perception demonstrates that humans cope poorly with dangers that are vast, abstract, temporally distant, or beyond individual control, precisely the characteristics defining both Lovecraftian cosmic horror and contemporary systemic threats like climate change, algorithmic manipulation, or potential artificial intelligence risks. When faced with such threats, human cognition defaults to seeking concrete, actionable responses, specific vulnerabilities that individual or collective action might exploit. The vulnerability catalogs, the exhaustive wikis documenting elder sign, variations, and entity-specific banishment formulas represent displaced anxiety management. We cannot easily conceptualize or emotionally process genuinely undefeatable threats, so we practice on fictional ones where weaknesses definitely exist because authors needed to end their stories. The compulsive documentation becomes psychological rehearsal for confronting real cosmic horror while maintaining comforting illusion that sufficient research always reveals exploitable weakness. The epistemological paradox embedded in Lovecraft's vulnerability concepts has become unexpectedly relevant to contemporary information theory and knowledge management. If understanding an entity sufficiently to identify its weaknesses requires exposure to information that damages the understander, then knowledge itself becomes double-edged weapon that might harm wielder more than target. This mirrors contemporary concerns about information hazards, concepts or data that cause harm through being known. Researchers studying artificial intelligence safety worry about basilisk scenarios where merely comprehending certain ideas about future AI systems could make one vulnerable to manipulation or harm. Cryptographers and security researchers practice responsible disclosure, recognizing that publicizing system vulnerabilities before patches exist creates danger, even while eventually increasing security. Lovecraft anticipated this dynamic. The Necronomicon contains protective formulas, yes, but accessing them requires reading text that destroys sanity and meaning. The protection exists, but cannot be safely accessed, creating permanent tension between knowledge as power and knowledge as poison. The narrative necessity that shaped Lovecraft's inclusion of monster weaknesses illuminates broader truth about human meaning-making and story structure. Cognitive scientist Mark Turner's work on narrative imagination demonstrates that human thought operates fundamentally through stories requiring causation, agency, and resolution. We cannot easily think in non-narrative modes. Even philosophical or scientific reasoning gets packaged into story structures. This creates profound problem when encountering genuinely non-narrative phenomena, quantum mechanics, deep time, cosmic scales that exceed story logic. Lovecraft attempted to create non-narrative horror, entities whose existence and actions follow no story logic, no character arc, no comprehensible motivation. Yet even he could not entirely escape narrative necessity. His stories required enough structure for readers to follow, enough agency for protagonists to investigate, enough weakness for plots to resolve. The vulnerability exists because stories demand vulnerability, because human cognition cannot sustain pure, non-narrative horror. What this reveals is not flaw in Lovecraft's execution, but limitation in human cognitive architecture. We literally cannot think cosmic horror without domesticating it into story form that includes exploitable weakness. Modern systemic threats demonstrate the stakes of this cognitive limitation. Climate change operates according to physics, unconcerned with human narrative or justice, affecting timescales that exceed individual experience. Distributed across countless causal factors, no single action can address. Algorithmic systems increasingly determine life outcomes through processes too complex for individual comprehension, optimizing for objectives misaligned with human flourishing. These represent genuine cosmic horror in Lovecraft's sense, vast, inhuman, indifferent forces that might destroy us not through malice, but through operating according to principles that don't include human welfare as consideration. Yet public discourse treats them using frameworks borrowed from fiction where monsters have weaknesses. If we just find the right policy lever, the correct technological solution, the proper international agreement, we can defeat the threat. This might be necessary fiction. Despair leads to paralysis, but it also might be dangerous delusion preventing adequate response to threats that genuinely possess no convenient vulnerability awaiting discovery. Evolutionary psychology suggests we may be hardwired to seek enemy weaknesses as survival mechanism, inherited from environment where threats were concrete and defeatable. Predators had vulnerable points. Competing tribes could be outmaneuvered. Natural disasters could be weathered through proper preparation. Human intelligence evolved in contexts where identifying weakness provided genuine survival advantage, where pattern recognition and vulnerability exploitation constituted adaptive behaviors. This cognitive inheritance serves us poorly when encountering threats operating at scales or through mechanisms our pattern recognition systems never evolved to process. We see weakness where none exists because our brains cannot not see patterns, cannot accept that some phenomena genuinely possess no exploitable vulnerability. The Lovecraft fan compiling comprehensive entity weakness catalog and the policy analyst searching for climate change solution share fundamental cognitive drive, the desperate need to believe that sufficient analysis reveals actionable weakness in every threat. The contemporary resonance of Lovecraftian vulnerability concepts appears most clearly in discourse around technology, particularly artificial intelligence and surveillance systems that seem to possess mythos-like qualities of incomprehensibility and inhuman operation. These systems make decisions affecting millions through algorithmic processes too complex for full human understanding, optimized through machine learning that discovers patterns invisible to human cognition. Public discussion seeks their weaknesses, regulatory frameworks, technical limitations, design vulnerabilities, with the same urgency academics bring to cataloging old assigned variations. Perhaps these systemic threats genuinely possess exploitable weaknesses. Perhaps, like Lovecraft's entities, they can be constrained through proper knowledge and action. Or perhaps the search for weakness represents anthropocentric thinking projected onto phenomena that don't operate according to rules permitting the kind of weakness we hope to find. The disturbing possibility is that some modern threats resemble Lovecraft's entities, not metaphorically, but structurally. They are material phenomena with physical properties, yet those properties may not include convenient vulnerabilities exploitable through human-scale action. The final unsettling implication concerns what our need for vulnerable monsters reveals about human relationship to meaning and agency. Lovecraft attempted to create fiction where human action doesn't matter cosmically, where we survive through accident rather than merit, where knowledge destroys rather than empowers. His audience, then and now, cannot entirely accept this vision and compulsively create structures reasserting human significance. Comprehensive weakness catalogs, protective ritual practice, theoretical frameworks for defeating entities, confident assertions that sufficient rationality could overcome cosmic horror. This reassertion might be healthy psychological defense mechanism, enabling continued function despite existential meaninglessness, or it might be cognitive trap, preventing us from developing appropriate responses to genuine threats that possess no narrative-satisfying weakness. Perhaps the real horror is not cosmic indifference, but our inability to accept cosmic indifference. That we must tell stories about vulnerable monsters because facing genuinely invulnerable phenomena would require cognitive and emotional capabilities humans do not possess. We document monster weaknesses ultimately because doing so affirms that we live in a universe where things can be understood, categorized, and potentially defeated. Lovecraft created entities designed to shatter this affirmation, then embedded enough vulnerability to permit stories that provided readers narrative satisfaction. The tension between these impulses, cosmic horror and narrative necessity, inhuman indifference and human meaning-making, remains unresolved because it cannot be resolved. The vulnerabilities are real and insufficient simultaneously. The protection exists and provides no safety. The knowledge empowers and destroys. We cannot stop cataloging weakness because our cognitive architecture demands the practice, yet the cataloging itself might constitute the very anthropocentric thinking that leaves us helpless before genuine cosmic threat. This is Lovecraft's most lasting gift, not the specific monsters he created, not even the philosophy he articulated, but the persistent, uncomfortable awareness that our desperate search for monster weakness might itself be the weakness cosmic horror exploits.